chapter 14, sooner or later you will be very embarrassed at what you actually do. This is something that you see often, and I feel this all the time with building the reciprocity project, is that it feels very embarrassing because you're spending, when you venture, you spend your time, resources, and money in something that other people can't see, and it doesn't see that there's not a direct relationship with anything that people can make sense of. That there is this, when you do it, what you're doing with venturing is you're trading off today that for something in the future. And you don't really understand what the future will be. You don't understand what the alternatives will be. And as well as you don't understand how good those outcomes of those alternatives actually are. And when you do this, sooner or later, you feel very embarrassed. And you feel that you could have done better. You think back and you think about, why did I make that mistake? And this happens as you get more experience with it, whatever you're actually building. So the idea that, all of these aspects of life, family life, or, getting an education, building an entrepreneurial venture, any number of different things. The idea that there is a direct, easy path, right? That there is this path where you just simply repeat, and then you get the answers, you get what you're expecting, everything roughly works out, is not true in a lot of domains, right? So there's this idea that life can be modeled by practice, by doing things like playing the piano, for example, or learning an instrument, or in school where you have this very guided path towards where you're going to. Each grade of mathematics builds on top of the previous grades of mathematics, and there's this clear path towards, the pinnacle, which is in high school, is learning about calculus. But in most of what we actually do, in most of the things that we explore of life, doesn't happen that way. When you venture, there is no pinnacle. It's simply just more repetition of the same. And then the same often doesn't pan out in the way that you thought it would be, because the world is ambiguous, it's unclear. You don't know what the right answers or right path actually is. So unless you were extraordinarily fortunate, where you had unbelievable mentors and knew what they were doing, that everything worked out in your favor, that it was a very clear and easy to understand path, unless you have that, most of the venturing paths that you'll ever do will be filled with a lot of things like embarrassment and regret, and thinking back and saying, well, why did I do that at that time? Why did I put money into that area? This is so embarrassing because this did not work out. This was not what I intended it to be. And I don't want to talk to people about this thing. And it's hard to talk to people about what you've been working on and being clear about it, because it does seem like you screwed up royally if somebody else was to look at it. One of the experiences that I often have with the reciprocity project is that people look at me when I tell them, I'm honest about how much I, spent, or I'm honest about how long I've been working at this. And they said, "You're still working on that?" Or, "You spent how much? You're insane." And it's embarrassing, right? When that happens, it's because the other people are not in your spot. They don't understand what it means to build something from scratch. They've never done it before. They have no idea. But for you that's interpreting that and getting that feedback, it's extraordinarily embarrassing. And it almost always humbles me. It makes me just pause and say, well, I'm not going to actually say that. I've gotten this with all areas. If you have, kids, for example, you'll get that where people say, "How much did you spend on your kids' sports or the activities they're doing? You've done that? What? Like, you're crazy." Or, my education, I've got unbelievable, 12, 12 years of formal education, university education. And people at the time when I finished it, people were like, "What? What are you doing?" Um, and this is a very honest response that actually probably does make sense from their perspective, and it makes sense from your perspective. It was incredibly wasteful and incredibly problematic. Everything, all of those things. My kids, the number of different sports that I've spent on them in terms of investing in soccer or whatever, the amount of money, they don't do any of that stuff. But we didn't know. You don't know. And that's the trade-off that you often have to face is you don't know. The process is endogenous. What does that mean? That means the only way you know is you actually spend time and money and resources to figure it out. And you don't have a clear answer until you spent that money and time. And when you've done that, you have to expect the failure rate, so things don't work out in the way that you intended it to, is going to be upwards of 95%, an enormous amount of failure rate with everything that you actually do when you're venturing. So what do you do in these circumstances where it's incredibly embarrassing to venture and there's no way out of it, right? The only way that you can actually do something and become successful with your venturing, however you might define that, is to push through it and to do more of it. So that's the key, is to think about how you can redefine what it is and what you're doing and redefine the search situation of what you're getting into and think about it as simply your identity or who you are or what you represent or what you're about. And that doing that thing is an essential part of your being, how you represent yourself, what that looks like. And by doing this sort of switch, right, you see this in other domains where people have some sort of stigma associated with what they're actually doing. By doing that and owning what you're about and owning what you're doing, even though it feels yucky, even though it's embarrassing, even though that, yeah, you're going to fail along the way miserably many times, it becomes who you actually are. So this is the important thing, is to think about this. Now, on the other side, there's a bit of a conundrum, because at what point do you take it too far? and you continue to invest and it becomes more and more part of your identity, even though it doesn't make any sense to what everybody else is doing. And the more embarrassing it gets, that it becomes more of who you actually are. And it's sort of this vicious circle. And that I don't really have an answer in terms of how to deal with that and what that actually means, other than recategorizing, rethinking about what it is that you're actually doing, and not necessarily view it so much as the thing towards success or some predefined path that you're destined to do, but view it in a different way where it is playful. It is something that you do as like this is a hobby, or that this is your fun time. All of these things, if you think about it, there's a lot of things that we do that, even though it's work, any number of different hobbies, going fishing, for example, that they all require a great deal of work. Knitting requires a great deal of work. And even though that you're doing this thing, it feels fun to you. And that you've redefined it, what it actually means, and becomes who you are by doing this thing. And now, if you were to think about fishing, people spend a great deal of time and resources and money on a fish. And if you were to add it up and look at the economic cost of fishing, it's enormous. It's catastrophic if you were to add it up. The number of boats that are out there that are incredibly wasteful, polluting the lakes and seas, and to get one fish. If you were to add all of that up, the economic cost of all of those things, of actually doing this and your time and effort, you would see that it would be astronomical compared to just buying that fish at the store and letting a professional agency or a professional industry actually deal with this. But you do it because it's your thing. And I think about that a lot with farming. A lot of us have backyard gardens. If you add up the economic cost of having a tomato that you grew in your backyard, you would be astounded on how expensive it actually is if you start bringing in all of the costs and you were to actually sell these tomatoes. So I want you to really think about that in terms of what it means to venture, and know that any given moment when you do things, there's massive costs. The only way that you can push through these costs and push through the embarrassment that you're going to feel, even though it feels like you're wasting your time, that everybody else is laughing at you, all of those things, that you simply just have to know that if I take this seriously, there is a chance, it's not guaranteed, that I can actually make this thing work. And that chance is probably really small. But the only way I know how to actually capitalize, to take advantage of that chance, is to endogenously invest in that particular alternative, even though it looks terrible and will likely be terrible. But you just don't know. It's like when you have kids, and I just mentioned that with kids and investing in sports, you don't know if your kid is going to be good at any given sport until you've invested far too much money, far too much effort in that particular sport. And if you pull back at any time, you don't know if that was the moment where you shouldn't have pulled back. And instead, you should have just invested, because another year there would have been a better coach, or another year they would have went through a growth spurt and things would have changed for them. And so the key thing to know with all of this is to simply just own what you are embarrassed of. It's embarrassing. It's ugly. But It is your path that you're pursuing. And there's no rights or wrongs because it's not clear. The only time you know it's right until 30, 50, maybe even 100 years have passed, maybe even longer. You don't know. But the only thing that you can do is just venture on and pursue that particular path and overinvest and be silly, be embarrassed throughout the process. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.